As World War I came to an end, another pandemic swept the world. Powerful Testimony tells a story of the flu that killed 50 million tonight at 9. And now, Politics Live with Joe Coburn.
It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Siobhan Baillie, former Shadow Cabinet Minister Barry Gardiner, LBC radio presenter Nick Ferrari and Guardian North of England editor Helen Pidd. Today, England finds out about life after lockdown.
I understand the impact that these measures will have, but they are necessary given the scale of the threat that we face.
Today, millions of people trying to survive in the second lockdown will soon be forced to endure further local lockdown restrictions.
Will this just be extended lockdown, Prime Minister?
Boris Johnson is out of quarantine. We'll hear from him later. But as the restrictions go on across the UK, the cost goes up.
The scale of the borrowing that we're undertaking this year is obviously not sustainable.
And there are big questions about where the government is injecting funds and where it isn't. So, as we've come on air, we're beginning to find out which parts of England are in which tier of restrictions. It's been a little chaotic, can I say, but we do know that the only places in the lowest tier of restrictions, in Tier 1, are Cornwall, the Isles of Scilly and the Isle of Wight. Now, as everyone was desperately trying to find out perhaps where they are in the restrictions, the website crashed. We can show you here. We were trying to find out exactly what was going on. There we are. Sorry, we're experiencing technical difficulties, and obviously everyone's been waiting for this. Someone who is very cross is Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker in the House of Commons, because he felt Parliament should have been told first. Let's have a listen to him.
This House should be informed first. We keep telling the government that is the way that good government should treat and respect this chamber. It is not acceptable to put it online. The only good thing is about the government, it's crashed, so it's not helpful. So it might be that we do get the statement first, but it is not acceptable.
A very cross Lindsay Hoyle there, but putting that just to one side and the fact that there are technical difficulties, you should be able to find out via a postcode checker. You already know, Siobhan, that your area and constituency of Stroud is in Tier 2. How do you feel?
Well, disappointed. I mean, I was arguing to make sure that we were returning to the tier system following the national lockdown, which I thought was really important. I was also arguing to make sure that the Gloucestershire County was looked at differently to the whole of the South West. But we were in Tier 1 prior to the national lockdown, and we were hoping to return. But looking at the way the cases have ticked up, we're flatlining slightly in Gloucestershire, about 156 per 100,000. But no, it's disappointing. But we've got to, retail can still continue, hospitality can still continue. I think there's arguments to be had about making changes as well within these tier systems. I don't think it should be a closed book, and I don't think the government is treating it like a complete... They are listening.
Right, are they? Are you making those arguments?
Yes, yeah. I mean, the WhatsApp groups are bouncing up and down, as you can imagine.
I bet they are. I can't keep up with the WhatsApp groups that are abounding everywhere. Barry, Tier 2 for London.
Yes,
were you arguing for any sort of different treatment for parts of London?
Well, look, no, I wasn't. I don't blame the government for the inevitable impact of the coronavirus. I do blame them, or in fact the Office of Budget Responsibility blames them, for the late response that they made in going into the first lockdown. That meant it had to last longer. And then for not listening to SAGE and the scientific advice about the short circuit break, and then we've had to go into lockdown after that. And that, of course, just that alone has cost an extra £12 billion. And if you're looking at the summer, the recovery from the summer, the OBR says was much longer than it should have been. And we were still 8.5 30% down on our output levels from pre-COVID days at the end of September. So this has had a huge impact upon the economy. No, of course, we had to go into lockdown.
And so you accept the sort of tiers as they are now and London's place in them?
Look, I accept the way in which the government is handling this. I'm not going to undermine anything the government's trying to do to save life. But I do think we have to be clear about this is all top-down telling people what to do. And it seems to me that if the government were saying to those areas that are going into Tier 3, like Manchester, look, here's what we're going to do for you to actually alleviate the problems, then it would be much more of something that people could see there was a benefit. You know, getting rid of rates for businesses,
I understand, and I'm going to slightly stop you there because we are going to go into this in a little bit more detail. But just to get the initial reaction, Nick, what about your listeners and you?
For my listeners, I imagine, Joe, good afternoon to you, they will see this almost as a football match. If you are, and this is the key, and to Barry's point, if you find yourself in Tier 3, if you are in Division 3, what does your team have to do to get yourself back into Division 2 or even into the Premier League? And to Barry's point, this is what you have to tell the people. Simply plonking them in Division 3 is not enough. Give them the route through what they can actually do and make sure those reviews, it's not just a grandstand, there is an actual review that moves people up and down the leagues.
Right, hopefully we're going to get a little bit more information around precisely that. Now, Liverpool, which was in Tier 3, has moved to Tier 2, so there has been a bit of movement, but actually, Helen, your area of Greater Manchester is in Tier 3, where it has been, hasn't it, sort of relatively speaking, for months?
Yeah, exactly. I'm just so infuriated and cross and really quite sad at the prospect of yet more lockdown. In Stockport, where I live, we have been locked down since the 31st of July, so nearly 4 months now. And when I look at the figures, it just doesn't make sense to me. You know, how can it be that in Stockport we've got 220 cases per 100,000, and yet there's areas of London, for example, Redbridge, they've got 300 cases per 100,000, and yet they get a lot more freedom than us. And it just feels so unfair. And like Nick said, you know, tell us, government, what do we need to do to get out of this? We've had 4 months of sacrifice, and for what?
Well, we're going to, again, go into that in a little bit more detail because, as you say, Greater Manchester has been there for many, many months. Let's catch up with Catherine Da Costa, the BBC's health correspondent, and actually find out... Catherine, can you just broadly give us an outline of the restrictions for Tier 2 and Tier 3, since most of the country is in those two tiers?
Yeah, sure. And across all tiers, shops, beauticians, hairdressers and gyms will be opened, but specifically in Tier 2, which affects much of England, you can't mix inside, and it's the rule of 6 outside. And in pubs and restaurants, they can only open if they're serving a substantial meal. Tier 3, that's the very high tier. No mixing inside or in private gardens or hospitality settings. So you could only meet in a group of up to 6 in places like parks in the countryside. And pubs and restaurants won't be able to open. They can, though, offer takeaway and deliveries. You're advised not to travel in and out of these areas, and leisure, entertainment, hotels will be closed. Mass testing will be offered in these areas. This is the lateral flow quick turnaround test with results in 30 minutes. They'll be used to help identify those without symptoms and get them to isolate. It's been credited in Liverpool as helping to bring cases down there.
What about, then, in terms of those areas? You mentioned Liverpool that's moved out, and we'll come on to how you do move around the areas. But what were the criteria for addressing the tiers in the first place?
Well, there's a number of factors. Interestingly, a number of cases, in particular those over 60, as they will be most at risk from this virus. How quickly cases are rising and falling, pressure on the NHS, so the number of beds and staff available, and the local context, so how an outbreak has been contained. So the idea is that tiers can move up or down depending on the level of progress made. The idea being that in an area that is able to slow the spread of the virus, it could move down the tier. So, for example, in Liverpool, again, it's moved from Tier 3 down to Tier 2. Now, there has been some previous criticism of the government previously that it wasn't quick to respond quickly enough and moved areas into higher tiers. So this time round, the tiers have been strengthened, and spotting those things early will be key. They will be reviewed. The earliest review is expected on the 16th of December, and Labour is calling for the results, the data there, to be published.
Right, now questions are being asked about the way the data has been presented. This is about the vaccine from Oxford University and AstraZeneca for their vaccine. We got early findings of that on Monday. Can you explain what's happened?
Yes, on Monday, Oxford and AstraZeneca published 3 figures for the effectiveness of their vaccine. So 62% was if 2 full doses were given a month apart, 90% as if a half a dose was followed by a full dose, and 70% was for the average. Now, about 3,000 volunteers were given this half dose. That wasn't planned. It was reported to the regulator, and then that was... the trial was then given the go-ahead to proceed. It's important to stress that there was nothing wrong with the safety here, and it turns out that actually the half dose followed by the full dose provided a higher level of protection against COVID. We're still waiting for the full data. That will be submitted to the regulator and published in the Lancet, and it will be down to the regulator to approve the Oxford vaccine, that it's safe and able to be rolled out widely.
Catherine, thank you very much for joining us. Just before I go back to the panel, let's hear Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, in the Commons about the tiers.
We will do this by returning to a tiered approach, applying the toughest measures to the parts of the country where cases and pressure on the NHS are highest, and allowing greater freedom in areas where prevalence is lower. While the strategy remains the same, the current epidemiological evidence and clinical advice shows that we must make the tiers tougher than they were before to protect the NHS through the winter and avert another national lockdown.
Matt Hancock there. Has the government been clear enough?
Well, I haven't seen the statement. I've been walking over here, as you know. But I think Nick is right. I think there's got to be an element of people feeling control over their lives and being able, if they work hard, that they will be able to go down the tiers. And we've heard sort of from the clips that you've had here that is the government's intention. I think the government could help itself by providing more information, understanding the trade-off, why the wet pubs are treated differently to pubs that are serving food, and giving that information. I mean, Gloucestershire is doing a huge campaign, sort of really saying, young people, for example, speaking to camera, saying, I've got anxiety, I want to get out of this, do it for Gloucestershire, let's really work together. But we've got to know that if we do that work, then we'll be going down a tier, and certainly the 6 Gloucestershire MPs will be continuing to argue to make that happen.
I mean, Barry, there's no household mixing indoors for Tier 2 outside your own bubble, so that's no mixing in private homes or hospitality venues till March, possibly, depending on what happens. What impact will that have?
Well, look, it's going to have a huge impact, and this is why I'm saying that the Chancellor yesterday in the fiscal statement really made many of the wrong moves, because he was taking money out of the economy rather than putting it into the economy for those people who are most likely to spend it. So the whole business of a pay freeze for what is in effect 2.5 million workers, they're the very people who will be out there spending every penny they've got because they have no disposable income. And yet, the Chancellor said, oh, well, actually, relative to private sector workers, over the last year, their wages have gone up, private sector workers have gone down. But the Institute of Fiscal Studies has said that actually the relative position of public sector workers to private sector workers is at a 25-year low. These public sector workers have had 10 years of having their wages eroded.
All right. Well,
so
let me put that.
Really important.
Well, we're
going to
talk about the spending review. I want to sort of stick to the restrictions, but Siobhan, answer the question. I mean, that sounded like austerity for public sector workers?
Well, it wasn't a complete pay freeze, and I question Barry's figures, because I think we know that the NHS workers, for example, will continue to rise, and people under 24,000.
There's 5.5 million public sector workers,
but
3 million have been taken out.
I think what the country understands is that the secure job is going to be worth an awful lot. And if we want to talk about getting people out spending, we saw through Eat Out to Help Out, for example, people are really willing to do that. But if they have no job at all, Barry, then they're not going to be able to do anything. And that's the balance that the government is trying to strike. And it's really difficult. It is really tough.
All right. Well, let's talk about the way out of Tier 3. One of them is via mass testing. Helen, is that the answer for Greater Manchester, to follow Liverpool and go for mass testing?
I have serious doubts about that. But can I just respond to something that Siobhan said, which really boils my blood?
Oh.
You know, she said, if people work hard, then they can come out of the restrictions. And the implication there is that people like me and the 2.8 million people in Greater Manchester have not been working hard and have not made major sacrifices. And yet it feels like we're being punished because we have more people who can't work from home, more people in low-paid frontline jobs who still have to go out to work. So I really resent the implication that it's to do with hard work.
Siobhan?
Anyway.
Well, no, I'll let Siobhan answer and then I'll come back to you on the mass testing. Yeah,
no disrespect intended, and you know, everybody is trying to make things to improve second cycles, and certainly people stuck in tier 3. It's not your fault. It's not of your making. This is a virus that everyone's trying to tackle. But so I apologise if I offended, because that wasn't the intention. But ultimately, it's the point about having control and knowing that if you stick to the rules, and then we can move forward. And tier 3 needs to be looked at quite carefully.
Nick?
If you apply, it's quite interesting, coming back to what Siobhan and Barry said, if you apply Barry's argument about the pay freeze to the tier row, there will be, in the 2.8 million people that Helen just mentioned, there will be people who work in hotels, in pubs, in restaurants, who will have no work and possibly no money now through Christmas. Those, of course, are in the public sector, those fantastic firefighters, police officers, they will have work. To Siobhan's point, I don't want it to be a race to the bottom, but at least those folk in Manchester will be able to continue to work and get paid, whereas those who are working in the pubs cannot. And I do think that's a key point that Siobhan was trying to make in defence of her.
Right. Well, and Helen, you said mass testing wasn't the answer necessarily as far as you were concerned.
Well, I don't think so. You know, having conversations with directors of public health in Greater Manchester, they do not want to emulate the mass testing programme in Liverpool, which they think is a poor use of public funds, and that it would be much better spent on targeted testing. For example, testing frontline workers, key workers. And, you know, there was a very interesting report on Newsnight the other night, which suggested that in the poorest areas of Liverpool, so the people who have the most to lose if they're forced to isolate for 2 weeks, I think they said that the testing take-up was only 4%. So, yeah, I would really question whether mass testing as it currently stands
Well, that is interesting, because I think it was looking at places like Knowsley, for example, which hasn't benefited Siobhan. The results do speak for themselves, I suppose, in terms of the infection rates. But, Siobhan, do you take the point that it might not be the best use of public funds?
Well, I think government has put money towards people that are isolating, trying to encourage that, make sure that they are supported. But in terms of targeted testing has got to be incredibly helpful, and it's certainly something that we're looking at in Gloucestershire. How do we get it to the care homes? How do we get it to, for example, people in maternity routes, and making sure that the tests are being used well. But I don't think we can deny that Liverpool, with the mass testing, we've seen the reduction of cases, and that's been a good model. So if we can get those tests out, then we should do.
In terms of when the restrictions will end, you will remember both the Chief Medical Officer, Barry Chris Whitty, and Boris Johnson saying that, you know, this will go on till March, April, but there will be light at the end of the tunnel at Easter time. Do you agree with them, or is there a risk that they continue beyond that?
Well, look, I've said on sitting here in this chair to you before, my view is that you have to get the R rate right down before you relax the measures. And the mistake of the first lockdown was when we thought the R rate was 0.7 or 0.9 between those two. We said, OK, now we can relax, even though the science said that it would increase by 0.3, so it was going to go over 1.
And will you back the restrictions, by the way, when you get to vote on them?
I absolutely, I'm not going to do anything that is going to undermine public health and public safety, because the government is, and I may disagree with the way in which they're handling it. I may disagree with the way in which they're financing it. But I absolutely believe it's right that we reduce the number of deaths from coronavirus.
And Christmas restrictions being relaxed, are you in favour of that?
For my own family, I'm actually in two minds about the Christmas. You
don't have to, of course, do you?
Indeed. And I think a lot of us are going to have to try and be taking perhaps choices that are more responsible than the government allows, in the way in which we organise our own families and our own relationships.
Just very quickly, I think that's a really important point. The government is actually, the four leaders are trusting the public. You don't have to go to the full 3 families. You don't have to use the full 5 days. You can take those sensible steps. And I think trusting the public is something we want to do more and more.
Nick, you mentioned there, in response to what Barry was saying about the the pay freeze, but also the wages of people who are working in hospitality, in hotels, in pubs. Perhaps they haven't got their jobs. You say they won't have money to spend. Many of them will be furloughed, won't they?
That's a point I wanted to make.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Many of them will be furloughed, but bear in mind they'll have been furloughed for quite a long time. They will be hopefully seeking to try and put some cheer around the Christmas table. But let's be candid with everybody. Many of them will be in businesses that regrettably may not even return in 2021. I don't need to tell, I'm sure, your viewers, this is the so-called golden sector in retail, particularly in hospitality. It's actually these 6 weeks when these pubs in Manchester, in the cities that we're talking about, and the towns and cities and villages that we're talking about, that's when they take their money. That's what sustains them, certainly through January and February, which are going to be tough. So let's not kid anybody. Some of these poor folk, they're never going to get back to work. And just to the point of testing, if we accept that as much as there can be a success story, Liverpool has at least come down. Does that not speak to, I just put Helen, perhaps the benefit of mass testing? Because Liverpool went for it, and they are in a better place, sadly, than you are this morning or this lunchtime. Does that not speak to possibly how that could benefit if you're trying to move up or down the tiers?
Yeah, quite possibly. It's just a very, very expensive and quite blunt tool, I would say. But I mean, hats off to Liverpool. I might be slightly envious of the fact that they'll be able to go to the pub next week.
The rivalry, yes.
Yeah, but, good on them. But I think given the amount of money that's already being spent to combat this crisis, I'm not sure whether mass testing is the best use.
Right, I'm just going to show everybody and read them to you, Nick and Helen. These tweets from Steve Baker, the Conservative MP. He has railed against a lot of the restrictions by the government. The authoritarianism at work today, he says, is truly appalling. But is it necessary and proportionate to the threat from this disease? The government must publish their analysis. And goes on to say, on the economy and on coronavirus, I fear we are now so far down the rabbit hole that we have forgotten we even entered it. Is there a sense of that, Nick?
There is. On the side of what Steve is saying there, it's no longer acceptable, I think, for the chief medical officer, the chief scientific officer and the Prime Minister to say, we are doing this because we told you so. We need to see the workings. But in the column against, I remind you the figures that we heard from Matt Hancock. As we speak today, 16,570 people are in hospitals in our country suffering with COVID. 696 people succumbed to COVID yesterday. That's the other side of what we're dealing with.
Right. I mean, MPs like Steve Baker probably aren't going to vote in favour, are they, of these tiered restrictions? What do you say to them, Siobhan? Well,
I don't know. I mean, I've already said that I think it would be helpful to the government to have more information, and certainly we're all pushing to understand the data and what it means for our areas. But I think, ultimately, we've got to be able to review this. We know that the earliest review is the 16th. I think it should potentially come back to Parliament, and I think that there should be a constant overview and looking at the workings. And I don't shy away from that. It's just a very, very difficult situation for everybody.
Right. I mean, Helen, would you like there to be a more localised view of this, so that it would be local authorities rather than regions, which might make it easier for parts of the country like yours to come out, even if other parts of Manchester don't?
Well, in my dream world, yes. Stockport in Stockport, we would be going to the pub and the restaurants and having a nice time. But the reality is, Greater Manchester is a very interconnected region, and my office is in Manchester, which has a higher rate than Stockport. So I do accept that there are practical difficulties in singling out small areas if you're going to allow people to move around. All
right, well, we'll leave your dreams just there for the moment. We're going to go back to the spending review, the statement yesterday. Fairly grim reading from Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, and obviously watching him in the House yesterday. The Daily Mail has this headline: "This is going to hurt Britain." We can show you how The Guardian has covered it. "Biggest UK slump in 300 years." Some of those figures were pretty staggering yesterday. I'm going to go on to one part of the announcement, which is covered inside The Times. We can just show you the headline there. Rishi Sunak says levelling up regional cash will need MPs' support. Now, this is the levelling up money of £4 billion for areas in most need of investment. There is some controversy, though, as to how you can actually bid for this money. Rishi Sunak has said that you can submit bids to the fund for specific schemes. They must command local support, including from their Member of Parliament. What's wrong with that, Barry?
Well, what's wrong with it, Joe, is that it's a repeat of what happened in the Towns Fund earlier in the year, when 60 of the 61 local areas who were able to access that funding turned out to be either Conservative marginal seats or Conservative target seats within 3,000 votes. 61 of them, 60 were those target seats. And even they included Robert Jenrick's own constituency of Newark, which was given £25 million, even though on any scale of deprivation, the government's own scale said that he was 270th in terms of deprivation.
Well, let's put that to Siobhan.
It is a pork barrel slush fund for political manipulation, and actually Siobhan's constituency is one of the key ones. I think, Siobhan, congratulations to you. You were the first MP, Tory MP in Stroud. It was one of those seats. So this is yet again corruption with the way in which the government is using
Well, they're fairly strong words. Pork barrel politics and corruption,
A couple of corrections. First female MP for Stroud. There has been Neil Carmichael, might be good. But and I didn't get any cash for the Towns Fund, and I am a marginal seat, and I was a target seat. So that isn't true. I would love some cash in my high streets, and I will be bidding. These centralised bidding process, we've seen it with the Beaching and the Railways Fund, the Towns Fund, and now the Levelling Up Fund. You know, it's for all of us to work together with our communities to make the case and to show why we need it. I mean, I think.
So why did 60 of them go to Tory?
The infrastructure fund, the Chancellor said about it being infrastructure for day-to-day life. You know, we need to look at railways, we need to look at cycling routes, we need to look at how we get jobs into our areas. We know that people are not going to be going into London so much, so market towns could do. I think the Levelling Up Fund is a ray of light in what was quite a difficult day, listening to the forecast yesterday.
Yeah, let me just go back, Barry, to your issue about it, which is clear. You think there is sort of pork barrel politics at work here, but it is all above board, isn't it? I mean, it is transparent. Anyone can bid for this money. I mean, where's the corruption?
No. Look, the point is this. The government is handing this out. Yeah. There are no clear criteria as to on what basis they're handing it out.
There are some criteria that have been announced. I mean, whether that will be the reality, but the criteria, as I have understood it, is that you can submit a bid. It has to benefit as many local people as possible, and it does have to have the support of a Member of Parliament.
Sorry, that's not criteria to compare one bid against the other. That's what I'm talking about.
But you could do it, couldn't you?
Everybody can bid in, and they did with the Towns Fund. And constituencies and areas and towns that were much higher up the list than Newark and Robert Jenrick's own actually bid into that. They were far more deprived, they had far greater need, and they didn't get the money.
All right,
it was politically manipulated.
Right, Helen, you're coming in?
I mean, the big joke with this, for me, is it's a fund which is administered from Whitehall, right? That's not levelling up. That's not empowering local regions. It's not empowering mayors to make the best decisions for the areas they know best. Yet again, it's pen pushers in Whitehall who've probably never been to half these places. And what's to stop them favouring their mates? The next Tory target seats, the majorities that are looking a little bit shaky. I think if they really wanted to level up, what they need to do is give those £4 billion, actually more than that, and they need to give it to local councils and mayors in order to spend the money, because they know their areas best.
Nick, wouldn't that be a fairer way of doing it?
Doesn't this all come full circle? I put to the panel and my learned friends. This is what we've been saying. This is what we've been saying about it. It's transparency, isn't it? That is, to Barry's point, we need to know how the money is doled out, because then if we can see the process, much as if we can see the process with the tiers, and I won't go back to that, but if we can see the process, then we can see that it has been fair, that it has not been corrupt, that Newark has qualified on these grounds or hasn't qualified on this grounds or whatever it is, and there's not this opaqueness and this understandable concern that Barry says that it's deals done in smoke-filled rooms. We would know that if it was transparent.
Right, well, Siobhan, wouldn't that just sort it out? Why not let local authorities and mayors, as Helen say, do the allocated? They know their local communities.
We've been handing billions and billions of pounds to local authorities all year. This is not a government that doesn't trust local authorities to make decisions.
So why not do the same with the Levelling Up Fund?
Well, I haven't seen the terms. I mean, so my proposal immediately on hearing about this is to bring together councils, our local G1 LEP, and actually look at what Stroud, the projects that we need for Stroud, so we can move forward and make those bids. A lot of bids are already flying around. You know, we want to get them landed and we want to get them implemented.
Is it important though to remove any air of suspicion, as you have heard from both Barry and Helen?
But I think I think the process and the application and the bid fund is open to everybody.
It is, but it's the
open
comparison. The important point is, why did Stroud get money over Brent, for example, if they were in sort of comparable
bids? With the greatest respect to Barry, I mean, the Secretaries of State that have been managing these funds, so for example, Grat Shapps and Ferganza, they've been on their feet for hours in the chamber answering question after question after question about this, and the civil servants and the processes are in place.
I mean, Helen, will people mind, and Barry, but Helen, will people mind how it is allocated, who is allocating it? Won't they just want money for local projects like a new road, a new train station, or an upgrade to a train station?
Well, they won't mind if they get it.
Yeah, precisely.
But they might mind if their neighbours got it and their neighbour happened to be a Tory target seat or a marginal Tory seat.
Nick, you're agreeing?
Well, yes. I mean, again, to come to the rivalry we explored earlier, Joe, if Manchester was to suddenly get a brand new ring road and a new hospital and Liverpool were to be left behind or vice versa, imagine how Helen, quite rightly, and her friends in Greater Manchester would be yelling about that. I don't know that that's the path down which we should tread.
Right, but is there any way, though, Barry, really, of doing it so that you're going to satisfy everybody and in terms of removing that rivalry and competition when you're bidding for money?
Yeah, look, the National Audit Office has just looked at the contracts that were let out during COVID and said that you were 10 times more likely to secure a contract, even if you'd no history in supplying PPE, if you had a contact with a government minister. Now, this is the state that our Parliament has come to. We have to have transparency, and it's called procurement. There's a perfectly straightforward government procurement process that says these are the criteria under which we will allocate you money or a contract, and this is what you have to have. And it's clear, it's done in terms of deprivation, it's done in terms of how many kids are on free school meals, it's done on all those different factors. But this is not. This is done on, give us a bid and we'll see if we like it.
Well, let's find out who is successful and come back on and discuss it again if you're putting bids in for that Levelling Up fund. Now, one of the other issues that we've discussed quite a lot of this week is about the cut to foreign aid. It was at 0.7% of GDP. It was enshrined in law. The Conservative government under David Cameron made a very big deal about it. It is now going to be cut to 0.5% on a temporary basis, so says Rishi Sunak, but it won't return until the fiscal situation improves. Nick, a good or a bad thing?
I sense this is why I have the privilege of being on your show today, Joe. You know that I have been a supporter of this for some time. I had two fairly heated exchanges with David Cameron when he was Prime Minister. Let's put it as simply as this. You don't borrow money to give to charity. We are borrowing extra billions. We find ourselves trillions in debt. Why were we ever harnessed to 0.7? I wonder, I've actually looked it up. I wonder how many of your guests there. It's a strange and sort of arcane process that ever happened. This actually, let's be very political here. David Cameron had this as part of the detoxification of the Conservative brand. That's why I believe he was married to it. And in times such as these, you don't feed next door's children before you do your own. It is a time-limited period. Money is still there in the event of a tsunami, a typhoon, an earthquake, as it should be. It's the various aid development projects in countries such as China, in India, that we are looking at, and I wholly and utterly support it.
Right, well, that was a passionate, obviously, a sort of speech, if you like, about foreign aid. But, Nick, that is not the only reason we have you on. There are lots of good reasons we have you on for, just to make it clear. Barry?
Look, it's a truly retrograde step. I'm deeply disappointed. But, you see, to take on Nick's challenge, and I think it is important that people understand this, you don't just give aid to other countries out of charity. You give aid to other countries for perfectly good economic reasons. When you give an aid package to a country, it improves their own economic position, it improves the GDP of that country, it improves the income for the people in that country. What do they then do? They then buy our goods and services. And actually, it's a way of increasing wealth around the world.
Well, talk to each other about it, because you're obviously
Barry, I'd love to see, and I know you, and I respect your position, and you're a very good advocate for this, but my listeners would say to you, Where is the audit trail for that? Where are the success stories? Where can it be shown that we've put money into a country that hasn't ended up, as people often say, buying Mercedes cars or Ferrari cars for dictators? Where has the orders come back and it's boom, boom, Britain? That is how my listeners would challenge you, Barry. Point to some orders that actually underscore what you've just said.
Well, look, we can point to those in many different countries. It's all, and the other thing.
Can you give any examples?
Not off the top of my head, but Nick, I'm happy to come on your show, right, on LBC once I've got my examples.
Listen, we're not arranging other people's shows here.
Look, the other thing is this. Next year, we take over the presidency of the G7. We take over the presidency of COP26. It is one of the most important years when we're leaving the European Union about the way in which we project influence and power in the rest of the world. What this has signalled is actually a withdrawal from the rest of the world. And what we need to be doing is we need to be showing the world that in terms of climate change at COP26, we are helping developing countries cope with those climate pressures because we believe it's in the global interest to do that, ours as much as theirs.
Nick, you respond, and then Helen, I will let you in.
Very briefly, I think you can do both. I hear what you say. Britain is in a very interesting position come the start of the new year. Just because we're trimming, I remind your viewers, we're trimming foreign aid, it doesn't mean we can't be environmentally responsible and take those messages forward, Barry.
Helen.
I mean, Barry says it's a retrograde step, and that may be true, but I think it's quite probably quite a popular one. So I spent yesterday in Rother Valley, one of the so-called red wall seats, you know, former mining constituency. People thought, no way will they ever vote Tory, and of course they did. And the Tory MP there's got a 6,000 majority. And I was asking people about Rishi Sunak's statement yesterday, and the thing that went down universally well was the cut to foreign aid budget and the idea that you've got to look after yourself first. So I think it's not just a kind of financial decision to cut foreign aid, but also a political one, which the Tories, I think, believe will win them votes.
Right, well, funny you should mention it, Helen, because we have this poll to show our viewers, YouGov poll, 2/3 of Britain, 66% support cutting the foreign aid budget, only 88% oppose. Underneath, Conservative, 92% in favour, 3% oppose. Labour, 44% support, 37% oppose. You can't get away from it, it's popular.
Oh, indeed. And I think actually most of all, it's popular within the Conservative Party, and it's part of Rishi Sunak's positioning for the post-Boris era.
Well,
and because he knows...
And Labour supporters.
Yes, but I'm talking about his own political future, and I think he's spent that $4 billion or saved that $4 billion with a very clear intent at... speaking to the right wing of his own party.
All right, and just to cover, is the majority, 2/3 of Britain support cutting that overseas aid budget. But Siobhan, a lot of people in your party very, very unhappy about it for the reasons, some of the reasons that Barry has outlined. And in fact, there was a resignation. Liz Sugg in the House of Lords resigned over it because she was, I think, very instrumental at the time when it was enshrined in law. I mean, what's this going to do to the reputation of the Conservative Party?
Well, I think the way the case that Nick made in Passion, I mean, I've been sort of, my weird hobby of knocking on doors, I've had that case made to me time and time again, and I've made myself unpopular on doorsteps and meetings defending the 0.7.
Oh, so you're unhappy about it?
Well, no, I was thinking very carefully about this, and Barry makes a case as if we're not going to be spending anything to support other countries. We're trimming, and actually we're still spending more than Canada and France, and you wouldn't say that they're unfair or unkind countries. And I think the other thing, the best thing that we can do for developing countries is to get our vaccine over the line, and the vaccine that doesn't actually need to be in sort of horrendous sort of conditions to be valid. We've got Oxford. The Oxford vaccine is going to do great things for the rest of the world, and we should be proud of that.
Right. I mean, Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, I think is going to be taking questions shortly in the chamber. Just finally, before we move on, very briefly,
yes,
though, Barry.
Joe, two things. One is trimming. It's a third of the budget. 5 billion out of a £15 billion budget. And the second thing is, it was a manifesto promise that you made to your electors just a year ago. Now, OK, you may have been knocking on a lot of doors since then where people have been unhappy about that promise, but you made it, you were elected on it, and you're now breaking it.
Siobhan?
I think the world has entirely turned on its head since we were in that election, and you know, nobody could have foreseen anything that we're dealing with. That we're dealing with this year. And you know, I go back to my point. This is not an eradication of support for an overseas budget, and it's a temporary. I mean, what I think the government could do, and what I was disappointed that she didn't do yesterday, was set a date for a review. You know, we should be back reviewing this in say 12 months and then 2 years. He's been very clear that it's a temporary position.
All right, temporary, but we just don't know for how long at the moment. We're going to play you a bit of Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor's statement from yesterday. It was the end of his speech, the peroration. Let's have a listen.
We in government can set the direction. Better schools, more homes, stronger defence, safer streets, green energy, technological development, improved rail, enhanced roads. All investments that will create jobs and give every person in this country the chance to meet their potential. But it is the individual, the family, and the community that must become stronger, healthier, and happier as a result. This is the true measure of our success.
Now, those words reminded many politicians and in the commentariat of somebody else. Let me show you this. Margaret Thatcher. This was an interview she gave to Woman's Own back in 1987. Who is society? There is no such thing. There are individual men and women, and there are families, and no government can do anything except through people, and people look to themselves first. Did you see the similarity, Siobhan?
I was really chuffed to hear the Chancellor talking about families. It's something, you know, what we've learned through COVID and what we learned through the elections last year, people got a real pride of their sense of place. They want to see improvements locally. They want to really concentrate on their family. And, you know, the most heartbreaking stories through COVID have been about, you know, people that haven't been able to see each other, with deaths, and you know, that focus on the family. We know that family breakdown is one of the fastest routes to poverty, and I don't think that even my party has been very good at actually addressing policy for family for many years. So bring it on. I was pleased. Right, you were pleased. Nick, did you recognise the similarity? Was Rishi Sunak channeling a bit of Margaret Thatcher?
Joe, you've got three people who are on the inside. Is it true that Rishi's just hired a tank and he's going to put the turret down on a white anorak and he's going to go hammering across Salisbury Plain? I think probably we're all making too much of it. I think Mr Sunak's popularity or otherwise, and whether he is going to try and emulate Margaret Thatcher, will depend on how he gets out of this COVID crisis. If he handles it adroitly, if he looks, as we started the programme, the worst debt in 300 years, if he steers us through that, then I think we could give him the Prime Minister, and he could probably run the England rugby team as well.
Right, we'll throw that in for good measure. Helen, we talked about it a little bit at the beginning of the programme, and Nick pointing to how we eventually get out of this. No one wanted to talk about tax rises yesterday. It felt too soon. We're still in this pandemic. But in terms of the words you heard there from Rishi Sunak, what do you think the hint is in terms of his direction of travel next year?
Well, to be honest, I'm not at all sure, but you'd have to be a bit daft to not assume that there's going to be some pain for all of us, and that we're going to be paying more taxes, and that some of the services we value will be cut. I suppose what I, on a personal level, don't really like about that speech is this sort of idea that this sort of individualistic society doesn't appeal to me. And one of the few bright spots, of course, in this pandemic has been community spirit and people who didn't know each other before, neighbours helping each other and coming together. So it seems a bit of a backward step to sort of encourage and celebrate closing in on yourself and looking after number one rather than society as a whole.
Is it difficult for Labour, though, to know where to go in terms of a sort of economic prospectus? Because at the moment, clearly, for the reasons we know, the Conservative government is inhabiting very much public state investment and public state involvement and intervention. For Labour, what's the position?
I don't think it's difficult at all, Joe. The Joseph Rowntree Trust analysed the cut that was made yesterday to universal credit. They said it would put 300,000 more children into poverty, 700,000 more people into poverty, and the cut would affect 16 million people, 6 million of them children. So when people talk about people and families and individuals, those are the people that are bearing the brunt of yesterday's announcement.
Talking about the £20 on universal credit. There was no cut, there was no decision made about it, and I think the Chancellor's going to be looking at that later on. So that's wrong.
I'm afraid we've run out of time. That's all we've got time for. Back on Monday. Bye-bye.
The second round is coming.
What a strike!
One weekend, 13 live matches across